Ben, of course, was raised in Middletown, and it turned out that my mother told me after we bought the place, she said, you know, your grandparents spent their honeymoon here in Betterton at the Maryland Hotel. And then my mother, subsequently, they brought my mother and her middle sister for vacations. They would come on the Wilson line from Philadelphia and on the steamships and get off at a pier. And yeah, he was born on this side of the town of Middletown. So he always thought of himself as an Eastern Shore man. And in fact, he had a very heavy Eastern Shore accent. When he went off to college, he spent the first 4 months trying to wipe it out. But as soon as he entered Delaware or got into, we'd say, Ben, talk Eastern Shore. Talk Eastern Shore. He could really lay it on with a trowel. It was very funny. Yes, we were looking for a place. We looked in the Adirondacks. We looked in Maine. We looked, and we were very serious about a place in Little Compton, Rhode Island, which was a Vassar retirement village. But we owned property in Middletown. And we were driving down every other month to check on the property, deal with the farmers, do the banking, get the crops, checks and things like that. And I said, hon, why don't we look in, in Maryland or in Delaware? And then our son was getting married in Baltimore, and we called Mary Jean Hudson, and Mary Jean found us a little cottage down the bluff here in Betterton, and that was it. He actually was studying Padua. And Venice was just a side trip. We had he was on a Fulbright, and we had spent the month of September in Perugia trying to learn Italian, and gotten to know one other person, a scholar named Stan Hunyaki, who with his wife was living in Venice because Stan was actually working on Venice. And so we would go into Venice to visit them by the day. But Ben was totally focused on Padua. Padua is a university town. I think it's the second, if not the third oldest university in Italy, right after Bologna. But for the next 40 years, he studied Padua. He had a reputation that he had read the entire archive for the 13th and 14th and 15th century of Padua. And Ben's work was on 14th century Padua, on the rise of a family named the Carrara, who were enlightened despots. But Ben spent a lot of time proving they weren't really despots, that they were enlightened rulers. Petrarch was one of their advisors, the famous poet. This is 1300s, and it's just at the time, the last of the family, it's just at the time when Venice is starting to take over the terra firma. And so the city in the early 1400s, the city falls to Venice, and Venice imposes its own government on the city. And that's how Ben got then interested in Venice, because the city was the foe of this family that he knew intimately. He went to Venice to study the structure of the government. That's what he was working on when he died, the structure of the government of Venice, because most scholars of Venetian history see the roots of a democracy in the Venetian hierarchy, the way the government was organized. It wasn't a democracy, but it had some pretty fail-proof ways of electing officials, so there couldn't be gimmickry in the election process. And so that's what he was doing. He created a phenomenal database that was published by the Renaissance Society of America and is online, free to anyone who wants to use it. And then he also he understood that a lot of the documents that he was working with were no longer consultable because they were falling apart. They were, from the 1300s to 1400s. So he began to use Hedgelawn Foundation money to pay for the digitization of those documents. And they too are online on the website of the Archivio di Stato di Venezia for anyone to use.
And so when we look at that book, let's talk about it, because it's really a tribute to him.
It is. It's Venice and the Veneto during the Renaissance, the legacy of Benjamin Kohl. Yeah. He would be flabbergasted at this.
Hold it up.
He was shy. He was humble. Never would believe that he had a major influence. There's 20 essays in here. 4 of them are ones that he gave during the last year of his life, and 4 scholars took them and cleaned them up and got the footnotes in order so that they could be published in this book, which is a rarity. You usually don't have a Festschrift where the work of the honored person is, but everyone felt that the essays needed to be published. I began working on the expatriate community in the late 19th, early 20th century, and my graduate work was on Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a Philadelphian, and I'm Philadelphian, and I felt some kind of a, affinity with him, despite all the problems of his anti-Semitism. And he lived in Venice. He died in Venice. And I was fortunate enough to, in 1985, to meet Olga Rudge, his mistress, and the mother of his daughter, Mary de Rakovitz. And I also met his grandson, Zitzo de Rakovitz, who taught Italian at Vassar for a year. So I really felt that I was almost obligated to do this work on Ezra Pound in Venice. And Olga and I got to be quite friendly for the last few years of her life, and before she moved into the mountains with her daughter. And so she and I would have tea, and we would go to conferences together, and I met all kinds of wonderful people who probably thought that I was Olga's amanuensis. I don't know. And we were 2 college professors who had managed to live on. Well, Ben always used to say, "I can't believe somebody's paying me to do what I love." Yeah. But we had, the money embarrassed Ben, and so he said, we're going to give it away, and he established the Hedgelawn Foundation, and that's how. And it's named, Hedgelawn is named for the house and the farm that he was born and raised on, which is on Route 301 across from, dare I say, Walmart.
It's still there.
It's, yeah.
It's not Walmart.
Well, it's kind of ironic that it's money that, not directly from Walmart, but the money that we've infused throughout Kent County comes from that land. Yeah. One of Ben's former students is the director of the Vassar Art Gallery, and towards Ben's later years, he became very interested in art patronage in the 14th century. And one of the things that he discovered, and maybe this is something he would take great pride in, was that the wife, the consort of the Carrara lord, was an art patron, and she, with Giusto da Meneboia, a 14th century Paduan artist, designed the baptistry in Padua. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous small building with an awful lot of local saints depicted. But one day Ben was in looking at the paintings, and he had this eureka moment, and he realized that he was looking at a portrait of the Carrara lord's wife. Her name was Fina Buzzicarini. I love to say it. It's just a wonderful name. But she was an independent woman. She had her own court, and she was an art patron. And that's one of, I think, that interest in art was what allowed us to say, well, yeah, it might make sense for us to be patrons ourselves. Well, we intended it to be a teaching gallery. We intended it to be used by the college. I also intended it to bring Chestertown onto the college campus. I think that a lot of people in Chestertown really miss out on a lot of things that could enrich their lives because they don't go on the campus. I don't get it. I don't understand it. But yeah, I taught theater. I taught, one of my loves was teaching dramatic literature. And so I had a Mellon grant to study with some really interesting people at NYU, and I went back and developed a modern drama course and probably taught it for about 20 years. And so I lived theater. I took students to London to see theater I did that for 13 years. And I had a colleague who taught political science. And so we developed a 2-week course, and during the day, they would do politics, and they would go to Parliament, and then during the evening, we'd go to the theater. And we actually taught classes in London. We had a room reserved, and we always stayed at the tacky Tavistock Hotel on Tavistock Square. So my interest in theater sort of came natural. Ben got his art gallery. I got the Prince Theater, and of course, how could you say no to John Stratweiser?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
He was the executive director at the time. I worry about the Garfield. I don't think it's found its footing yet. I think it's having a hard time defining what it is. It shifts so, and I'm proud of that lobby. I think it's beautiful. I think the Kohl lobby is spectacular. I wish we could use it more and more creatively. And I think that the art gallery, it's actually going to close next semester for renovations. And then we'll hope, well, I don't think anybody knows it. I probably just spilled beans. Yeah. And then they hope to open with a blockbuster show in the second semester. And have a director. Alex is only an interim director, and if he's going to continue to run Sandbox, he can't do both. It's just, I don't know how it's just, the work he's done has been extraordinary. Well, my other love is the Miller Library at the college. I'm the chair of the Friends of the Miller Library. We're a small, hardworking group. And we fund a fellowship, the Ralph Thornton Fellowship, for a student to do research side by side with a librarian in the Miller Library. And very few people know this, but Ben came to Washington College and discovered there was no archive. 10th oldest college in the country, no archive. So he began a campaign to get an archive, and he funded, this is just beside the Kohl, gallery.
What a rich world.
I've been very, very lucky.